Okay, and now we have Russia. Russia, the largest country on Earth when it comes to land mass. Of course, it used to be the biggest part of the Soviet Union. Now the Soviet Union is no more, and Russia's divided up into a whole bunch of little provinces. In fact, Russia used to only be one province of the Soviet Union, but now it's, of course, it's its own country. And Russia has, of course, a rich and complicated history. Before World War I, it was ruled by czars, which were essentially like kings. They were autocracies, and absolutism, which means that they were absolutely in control, and they were the sole government. There was no real democracy. They were essentially like kings. During World War I, the communists carried off a successful revolution, the October Revolution of 1918, and the Communist Party took over, and that was led by Vladimir Lenin in 1917. He ruled until in 1924, Stalin took over, who further centralized the power. He was, of course, a brutal, brutal dictator, and he was the one that led Russia through World War II. But he killed, by some estimates, tens of millions of people, and he was very, very much a dictator. And he sent political opponents and people he didn't like to the gulags, which were the Russian prisons, and he ruled Russia with an iron fist. And essentially, it went on like that. Even after Stalin's death in the 1950s, other people took over, and there was a succession of communist dictators that ruled until about 1985, when Gorbachev took over. Mikhail Gorbachev, who also was a communist, he was also the leader of the Communist Party, and he was installed by the Communist Party in Russia, but he led a little bit of a friendly policy to the West. Glasnost, perestroika. There was also detente. All those things basically mean opening things up to the West, rather than just being the enemies of the West, like countries like the United States and England and France. They dealt with the United States, and there was more dialogue, and certainly Gorbachev led, certainly led a more of an opening, more of a little bit of a thaw. Until 1985, there was what they call the Cold War between Russia and the United States, which there wasn't actually physical fighting, but there was a lot of rhetoric and a lot of, there was a lot of fear that there was going to be an actual war. Thankfully, that never happened. And in the late 1980s, after Gorbachev's reform, the USSR basically fell apart. The USSR stood for the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, and the reason why it fell apart is because under communism, from after World War II, really even before World War II, all the way through the late 1980s, the Russian economy had been extremely weak. People had been living very poor lifestyles. And eventually they got tired of it, and when Gorbachev released a little bit and wasn't as brutal on his own people, the various other provinces kind of went their own way, and the USSR kind of fell apart. Between 1990 and 1993, they were kind of falling apart. In fact, I remember in 1992, just as an aside, during the Olympics in Spain, this was after the USSR had fallen apart, but while it wasn't clear exactly what was going to happen with all the different provinces that were breaking apart. Provinces like Belarusia, Ukraine, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, and all these other countries in Russian provinces that eventually became their own countries. They all went to the Olympics together as one big country. They called themselves the CIS, the Commonwealth of Independent States, because they were saying we're going to play together, but we're really not together. That was just an interesting little thing during that transition period. But by the mid 1990s, they had completely went their own way. The Russian government works as follows: you have the president. The president is the person who has the main power. It used to be Vladimir Putin. Now Putin is actually Putin was the prime minister, then the president, or whatever. Anyway, he appoints the prime minister and the other members of the executive branch. So the president is the head of state and also is very powerful in the government. Some countries like Israel have a president who is just a figurehead. Russia, on the other hand, is a president who, like the United States, has a lot of power in the government as well. He can also issue presidential decrees, kind of like executive orders in the United States that have force of law. He oversees the ministries and other bodies concerned with coercion, means enforcing the law enforcement, state security, and the president is the guarantor of the Constitution. which is kind of strange because usually a constitution is the sort of thing that tries to make sure that a president doesn't get too powerful. So if you have a president who gets to control the constitution, then, well, could lead to a president getting too much power. And in fact, that's what happened. Vladimir Putin, who's the president of Russia, has really tremendous power, and it's very, very difficult for anybody else to gain any power in Russia. So even though Russia has technically a democratic society, certainly the power is concentrated very much in Mr. Putin. You also have the prime minister, who's primarily responsible for social and economic policies, and of course he is handpicked by the president, so the president kind of indirectly runs the government. Under the old system, which was the communist system, which was in effect really, I guess, until the early 1990s, a communist is a political theory derived from Karl Marx and Frederick Engels also, but really Marx is the main father of communism. And communism advocates the idea of a class war. Essentially, without looking at the slide, what communism says is that the people, the laborers, the workers who work for the companies, work for the factories, will eventually rise up and overthrow their bosses and overthrow the capitalist owners who are there to try to make a profit. And the workers will then take over the companies and run them how the workers see fit. And the theory behind this is that all property should be publicly owned. In other words, nobody should own anything. It should really all be owned by the government, and each person is paid according to the abilities and needs. That's the theory, at least, where every person gets whatever he or she produces. Now, of course, that decreases the incentive for people to become good workers, because if you're going to get paid one way or the other, why should you innovate and invent things? And that's really what happened under communism. People stopped innovating, which is one of the reasons why communism fell. And of course, also one of the one of the unfortunate things about communism is that Russia was not a law-governed state, which means that it was governed by the government's whims and not necessarily by by the law. As far as the Russian economy goes, although the Russian economy is in a little bit better shape than it was under the communists, it still is not in great shape. First of all, the income inequality is still high. Interestingly enough, for communism is all about everybody being equal, and nevertheless in Russia today you have some very rich people, but a lot of people who are extremely poor. Income inequality is one of the highest in the world. Corruption during communism was very high. Government officials tried to, and did, in fact, keep a lot of profits that were supposed to go to the workers for themselves and use their political power to give them a leg up and in political favors. And corruption has unfortunately continued even in the last 2 decades after communism fell. So Russia obviously still has some problems. It is more of a free market system, but it's more autocratic. In other words, the president has a tremendous amount of power. There's not a lot of political freedom, although there is more than there was under the communists. And also the economy, while better off, is still has some problems and very high income inequality and a substantial amount of corruption in the government. Next up on our list is China. China, a country, of course, the biggest country in the world by far in terms of population, with about 1.4, 1.5 billion people in it, almost 5 times the United States. Of course, takes up a lot of the Asian landmass. You can see that the shape is actually quite similar to the shape of the United States. This, of course, being in Asia. You have most of the population along the eastern seaboard of China, huge cities like Beijing over here, Shanghai down here, etc. So let's take a look a little bit about the history and politics of China. Originally, I guess hundreds or even thousands of years ago, you had the philosophy of Confucianism, after, of course, the great philosopher Confucius, which had a conservative philosophy and a hierarchy of harmonious relationships. Basically, the idea that people should essentially follow natural law, natural orders. People can cooperate with each other. I mean, Confucianism, you can spend a long time studying it. But it's basically about humanism and about loyalty, very much what East Asian countries are famous for in terms of loyalty to authority, humanism, making sure that people have rights and comfort. Well, not really comforts, but responsibilities, if you will. The Chinese Communist Party started to really gain power, or really took over, after World War II. During World War II, China was ruled by Chiang Kai-shek, but he was eventually exiled, and the person who took over, his name is Mao Zedong, AO, I'll just call him Mao. But Mao was the communist ruler of Russia really through, I guess, the 1970s, I guess. And he was an avowed communist. He also happened to be a dictator. There were no elections basically through his rule. In fact, during his rule, there was tremendous putting down of any dissent people were. It was kind of similar to the Soviet Union. In fact, it even says over here, learning from the Soviet Union, in that you had one basic leader, you had a communist philosophy, and you had brutal repression of anybody who disagreed. Mao enacted what he called the Great Leap Forward. Whether it actually was a leap forward or not is a different question. But there you had a program with economic goals and tried to rapidly change the country from an agricultural economy, mainly based on farming, to industrial development. And eventually, so you had the retreat from the leap. In other words, there were some elements of it that didn't work out and were abandoned. You also had the Cultural Revolution to encourage nationalism, which is a feeling of patriotism for your country. Basically, you had the rule under Mao, and he had these various initiatives to try to get China into a more modern economic philosophy. But as long as China was under communism, again, most of you listening to this are probably too young to remember, but China back in those days, I mean back really into the 80s and even to some extent into the 90s, China was really considered kind of a backward society. In terms of that, most people didn't. Beijing, which is the capital of China, was called a city on bicycles because that's how people got around. They didn't have enough money to have cars. They didn't. They ate very basic foods like rice and bread, and didn't really eat a lot of meat. Again, that's not a bad thing, but China had a very weak economy and was backwards in terms of technological development. Now, of course, China's changed dramatically, as we'll see. And well, I'll tell you now, China since then, since eventually Mao's death, and there was the leader in the 80s of China was named as Deng Xiaoping, and Deng Xiaoping was much more into free market capitalism and led China into a different kind of economic philosophy that allowed them to develop much more quickly. And today, China, well, obviously doesn't have the same kind of wealth as the United States does, but still China is rapidly progressing towards what you would think of as a first world country. Certainly, China is the great manufacturing country in the world. China exports, has factories and makes things and exports them to virtually all Western countries, including and especially the United States. And the Chinese, consequently, are getting richer. How rich will they get? Who knows? But China's, for decades, their gross domestic product, their GDP, was growing at over 10% a year, which is incredible. Just to give you an idea, in the U.S., if we have 4 or 5% growth, that's considered pretty good. In China, you had over 10% growth every year for decades, and so China is rapidly catching up to the United States and other Western countries. In terms of political life in China, technically speaking, China is still a communist country, although it doesn't really behave like a communist country in terms of its market. It behaves more like a free market economy, but still, technically speaking, it's the Chinese Communist Party that's involved. Under Mao, in the Maoist era, under Mao Zedong, it really was communist. There were few personal freedoms, most political groups were repressed, and only the Chinese Communist Party, the People's Party, whatever, had any say at all. Today, people have more freedoms. People are allowed to vote as long as they're 18 years old and older, regardless of ethnicity, race, gender, occupation, etc. And the only people who still are repressed are people who there are certain political groups that are repressed in China. China doesn't have the same level of freedom as we enjoy in the U.S. today, but it still does have much more freedom than it certainly did under the Maoist era. China's economy is based on, part of it is certainly based on agriculture. I mean, this statement that China's mostly based on agriculture might be a little bit outdated. China's economy has grown dramatically and is undergoing economic reform. Again, this may be a little outdated. China really, as far as I'm concerned, has already undergone a lot of economic reform, but now has converted into really a manufacturing-based economy. China has the second largest economy in the world today, behind the U.S. Now, that doesn't mean, of course, when you measure economy, you can't just look at the overall gross domestic product. You have to look at the gross domestic product per person. China's got 1.4, 1.5 billion people. It stands to reason that they would have a pretty large economy. But if you look at it per person, then China is still well behind most Western European countries, but certainly is catching up. But overall, in terms of GDP, China has the world's second largest economy behind only the United States. It's the fastest growing major economy, and it has the largest manufacturing economy by far. So if you go to Walmart, you can pick up a toy from the shelf, turn it around, odds are it'll say somewhere made in China. In the old days, toys and trinkets used to be made in Taiwan and Korea and places like that. Today, it's mostly China, which has pretty much taken over the manufacturing of trinkets for the world. Okay, and the government does control still the Chinese economy. The consumer spending has a limited degree of government influence, which means that the government likes to make sure that China remains a production-based economy. In the U.S., we have kind of a spending-based economy. You hear reports in economic news about consumer spending. In China, the government wants to make sure that the Chinese government and the factory owners become very rich and they produce a lot and they generate these tremendous trade surpluses because they send stuff out of the country and don't import that much in. But on the other hand, the Chinese people themselves don't really benefit that much from the production. Chinese people who are working in these factories producing all our trinkets, they might work 65 hours a week and live in dormitories and not have, cars or nice clothing or anything like that, because the Chinese economic system is more based on production, which, has some advantages. It causes them to have a lot of American dollars because they sell a lot of stuff to the US. But on the other hand, it doesn't really improve the life of the people to the same extent that maybe it should. A huge area in Chinese politics, Chinese policy, is the issue of population control. China, which I keep saying 1.4, 1.5. I just paused the recording and looked it up, and it's actually more like 1.3.5 billion people. But it's a lot of people, well over 1.3 billion people in China. The U.S., by contrast, has only a little bit more than 300 million, which is less than a quarter of the number of people. And the Chinese population is actually growing slower than it ordinarily would. I mean, China has had over 1 billion people for a long time now. And the reason why it's growing a little slower is because China has developed population control strategies. Chinese don't want to get too big. They don't want to get the population that's already hard enough to sustain. And so population control is a big issue in China. The government has tried several methods to try to slow down the increase in population, including one child per family policy that actually made people they actually gave the family a birth certificate for one birth, and you only get one benefits if you have one child. You have to pay fines and extra taxes if you have more than one child, and even pregnancy without authorization. I don't know if they still do this, but would actually be aborted or terminated. It sounds like a pretty brutal policy, but they and still to some extent they do have the one child per family policy. And they also have tried to stimulate economic growth by moving to industrial, and that's based on the idea, which is something that's been true throughout the world, that economic growth tends to slow population growth. People who are wealthy tend to have fewer children for whatever reason. I mean, there are a variety of reasons that we don't need to go into, but historically, rich countries like in Europe tend to have very low population growth, whereas maybe Middle Eastern countries, Arab countries tend to have much higher population growths. So China has figured that by becoming more wealthy will naturally slow the population growth, even aside from the one child per family policy. There's also, of course, the benefit of population control is that access to natural resources is increased. Obviously, the more people that you have, the harder it is to divide up the natural resources among people. Medical coverage now includes birth insurance and workers' compensation for people who do follow the one birth policy. Coverage of natural gas has risen. Again, I don't know what that has to do with population control, but generally speaking, China has tremendous coal and natural resources for energy. Standard of living, of course, have also been raised by keeping birth rates down. If you have a family that makes a certain amount of money, obviously they're going to have more money to throw around if they have one child than if they, for example, had four children. And better policies, more urbanization and education, and could also help with population control. Again, the general trend throughout the world is that the more educated and the richer countries are, the lower their birth rate, turns out. Of course, you also have some problems with population control. First of all, they're hard to implement. They're people who are in rural areas that, it's not like even in China, the police don't crash down doors and, count the number of children in the kitchen. So it's kind of hard to enforce, especially when people are not going to hospitals when they're giving births in their house with midwives. It's kind of hard to specifically enforce the number of children that people have in rural communities. Number two, the programs have not seen that much success because fewer births have been reported, and this may be a little bit of an overstatement to say very few have complied with the law. I mean, the fact is that the Chinese growth rate has slowed down a little bit, but also you have the idea that other people from other countries don't like it. People in Western countries think that the one-child rule is kind of a violation of freedom. So China's had to deal with that from a political standpoint. Chinese have acted with more violence to retaliate for the laws. Chinese people, in other words, have not liked the one-child rule and have reacted to it. And so they used to have, it's just a terrible thing over here. The situation used to be that under the one-child policy, people for whatever reason wanted boys so that they could work on the farm, whatever, and especially in agricultural areas. And so, I mean, there were situations where people, if the daughter was born first, they would kill the daughter in order to have a child later, which obviously is, a crazy situation. But so the government reacted by saying, in some cases, if you have a daughter first, you can have another child. But again, that's obviously something that's more relevant for Chinese internal politics, and we don't need to belabor it. Hong Kong is a very interesting story. Hong Kong, I remember when it went back to China, Hong Kong was basically taken over by the British in the 1840s, in 1842 and 1860, based on wars, the quote-unquote opium wars, where the British wanted to sell their drugs to Chinese citizens and the Chinese government didn't want that, and whatever. I mean, there were other types of wars also between Britain and China, and basically Britain took over Hong Kong and said, okay, we'll give it back to you in 1997. That's what they said back in the 1800s, which probably seemed like forever, but 1997 did come, and the British did keep their promise and said, okay, we're giving you back Hong Kong now. Now, the interesting thing about Hong Kong was that Hong Kong was a country that the British basically let them do what they want, and so they adopted, while Chinese were struggling with communism, the Hong Kong decided to go with more of a capitalist system and a free market, and they did very, very well, throughout the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, while the Chinese were under Mao and were depressed from an economic standpoint. So the people in Hong Kong were very worried that, hey, when the Chinese take over, they're going to make us go through their communist system and all their silly policies, and we're not going to be as rich as we were. And so as it turns out, it hasn't. So they were actually Hong Kong. Britain didn't really care one way or the other, but the people in Hong Kong were very worried about being given back to China. But as it turns out, China has basically let them continue. China has not. Now officially, Hong Kong is now part of China, but China has still allowed Hong Kong to basically maintain the same policies and government as they had before 1997. So again, Hong Kong, that's where they stand right now. Hong Kong is still doing very well, although of course it is now considered officially part of China. Next up is Mexico, our neighbor to the south. You can see this is the United States, this is Texas, and this is Mexico. You have Cancun over here, where a lot of Americans go for vacation. You have the Baja Peninsula over here, which is near California, And Mexico, of course, even though it's part of North America, it's generally considered a Latin American country. They speak Spanish, of course. They were originally settled by Spain. And let's take a look at some of the rules regarding Mexico. The first issue is regarding the 2006 presidential election between Calderon and Lopez. And they had kind of like our 2000 election, where it didn't really, where it got settled at the last minute by the courts. But historically, throughout Mexican history, the PRI, the Partido Revolucionario Instruccional, and sorry for butchering. I especially apologize for any of you that might speak Spanish for butchering that word. In English, that means the Institutional Revolutionary Party. Again, so obviously that would be IRP, not PRI, but in Spanish it's a little different. Now, the PRI is kind of a left-leaning party. It's not quite a socialist party. Certainly not a communist party, but more, I guess certainly to the left of the U.S. parties. But I guess you would consider it somewhat close to the Democratic Party in the United States, but certainly a little bit more left-wing. Much more about social justice and a little bit of wealth transfer, things like that. Um, but they've started to lose some power as of late. But historically, this is the party that has dominated Mexican politics. The economy of Mexico, first of all, it's based on one important aspect, is that Mexico is part of NAFTA. NAFTA stands for the North American Free Trade Agreement, which includes Canada, Mexico, and the United States, and allows, this was signed, I think, by President Clinton in the 1990s, which said that there can be free trade between North American countries. So Mexico and the United States trade freely. In fact, many Mexicans come to the United States, whether illegally or illegally. And 90% of public revenue is collected by the federal government. In other words, the federal government is very strong in Mexico in terms of how much control it has over the country and over the economy. And that manifests itself in the general belief of the Mexican people that the government ought to control the economy. That's not really true in the U.S., where most people think the government should keep its grubby mitts out of the economy, at least to some extent, but the Mexicans believe much more in government intervention and control of the economy, which is why the PRI has done so well. As more of a liberal party, it believes in more government intervention. This probably should say profitability, not probability. But Mexico, although there's a lot of production going on, the Mexican economy has not benefited as much as many Western countries for the manufacturing that goes in there. And recently you've had a more neoliberal is the opposite of liberal. Neoliberal essentially means more of a free market, more of a free market philosophy. I mentioned before that Mexicans generally believe in government intervention, but recently, especially in the last 5-10 years, there's been more of a free market philosophy entering the Mexican system. And again, that's something that we discussed earlier in the recording, that this is the general trend throughout the world of having more free market system, which is also taken over to some extent in Mexico. In fact, the richest person in the world, Carlos Slim, is Mexican, and he has, I guess, a cell phone empire. In Mexico, you have in terms of interest representation, which means who controls the government, political control, you have the corporatist system, which you have people who are associated with different groups influence the government. You have groups that are interested in agriculture and defending, farmers' interests, business interests, ethnic interests, labor interests, and they help obviously influence the government, just like in most Western countries. You also, of course, have other groups that are important in the government: the military, the church. Mexico is a Catholic country, and most people are Catholics in Mexico. And the church has a lot of influence in the government, and entrepreneurs, people who are people who start businesses. You also have the patron-client relationship, which is a form of what we discussed earlier, interest aggregation, which means you have lots of people who combine their political influence in order to try to get something done. And that goes on in Mexico just like it goes on in other countries. It's an activity in which political demands of individuals and groups are combined into policy programs, and in Mexico they have this idea of groups of people trying to get together and control political policy that benefits them. But again, you have that sort of situation every country, pretty much every democracy anyway. Next, we move to Brazil, a country that has been certainly improving their economy over the last few decades, but has a little bit more of a problem of corruption and wealth disparity, as we'll discuss, than most other countries in the world. Brazil is actually the fifth largest country in the world by area, largest country in the South American continent, and it is the third largest country in the Western Hemisphere by area. Brazil has a system of elitist political philosophies. Really, that means the well-connected, the people that have ins with the governments, whether it be private businessmen or people who are actually part of the government, have the most political clout. A reciprocal relationship between groups of political actors known as patrons and clients and political parties. In other words, business people who get their connections in the government can actually do very well, whereas people who are just trying to break in and don't have the same level of political connections are in trouble in that regard. Brazil also has social welfare programs, and that is a concern about people who are in the Brazilian think tanks in the Brazilian government structure. Education and income concentration are two major concerns of the Brazilian people, that the education may not be benefiting the whole society, and also that there's a very large income concentration in a relatively small group of people. Political liberalization, which again allows more people into the political arena, has occurred because of pressure from business, pressure from the elites, there's pressures from the academics, and pressure from religion. Brazil, just like Mexico, is a Catholic country, and Catholic dogma has caused Brazil to adopt some social welfare programs. And as in all other countries, you have to look at politics at the elite level, in other words, the level of the actual people who run the government, and politics at the level of the people, politics at mass level. Regarding politics of the elite level, you have the military. The military, of course, is not in charge of the country, but certainly has a strong political place in the country, and that's where middle-class people can go to become a strong part of the government. One way they can do that is by joining the military and rising up in the military. Competence criteria for jobs, trying to make sure that people who have important government jobs, high-level government bureaucratic jobs in Brazil, have the competence to do that, and the expertise in an area that's technocratic. In other words, in technical areas of running government, that's really what allows people to rise high in the Brazilian government. As far as the mass level, in other words, as far as politics at the grassroots level, at the lower level, at the level of the people, that arises out of various identities, issues, political rights, social rights, etc. And the tactics used by Brazilian politicians, international allies trying to ally themselves with other countries, confrontation use. Of course, again, these are pretty comparable to other countries as well. The economy of Brazil is where it could be important to distinguish Brazil from other countries. Brazil was doing at first, probably around the World War II time, Brazil was struggling and really basically a third world country. And in the 50s, 60s, 70s, Brazil started to improve, and Brazil started to surge dramatically in terms of their economy. Brazil's considered one of the four countries, the quote-unquote BRIC countries, B-R-I-C. Brazil, Russia, India, and China are the four countries that have improved themselves dramatically from an economic perspective over the last couple of decades. So, but after this success, you also had periods of dramatic failure in inflation of the currency, when goods became much more costly and worth much less. In 74, they suffered economic reverses as an effect of the oil shock. Many Western countries, including the U.S., got hurt by the oil crisis of the mid-1970s. And through the 80s, Brazil has sustained a very high amount of foreign debt. You had the import substitution philosophy, which is the idea encouraging growth through industrialization. In other words, if there are products that the country needs, one way to get them is to import them. The other way to get them is to produce them. And the Brazilian philosophy has been to try to produce factories to produce things rather than importing them. Also, deregulation of financial and labor markets. Again, we've seen that over and over and over again, where the government takes a more hands-off approach, allowing the markets to work themselves. Today, you have some trends in the Brazilian government is to restrict imports, just like Japan, to have a little protectionism, where to make sure that the Brazilian manufacturing industries are healthy by making sure that things don't get imported without a tax, but unfortunately it cannot control inflation, which means prices go up wildly sometimes. The major problem you're going to find in terms of Brazil is actually, I think Brazil is the worst country in the world when it comes to, or one of the worst countries, when it comes to income inequality. And that is that people who are rich are very rich, people who are poor are extremely poor, and there's very little in between. Rich members of the population make up about 1% of the population, and they have 13% of all income. In other words, only 1% of the people make 13% of the income, and about 50% of the people are only getting the bottom 13% of income. Very, very high level of income inequality between the top and the bottom. One reason is because of the pro-rich tax system, where people who are rich are not taxed enough, or at least according to some people, and it's causing the government not to have enough money to give money to the poor people. There are also low levels of education. There's decreased social mobility because the poor have no way out. If the education is bad and the poor people don't get enough of an education to be able to move up, it makes it much more difficult for them to live an equal quality of life. There's a high illiteracy rate. Many people can't read. There also is a rural-urban divide. People who are in the rural areas, the less developed areas, the farms, they lack proper health care, education, technology, infrastructure, and have low employment opportunities, whereas the rich people and people generally who live in the cities have a little bit of better access to that sort of thing. But certainly income inequality and the fact that the lower component of the Brazilian society have it so tough is one of the major challenges when it comes to Brazil and Brazil's economy. Now we move a little bit to a different kind of country. We move to Iran. It's the only Middle Eastern country that we're going to discuss as part of this course. Obviously, we've discussed Western countries like France and Britain and Germany, Asian countries like China and Japan. We're going to take an African country a little bit later on. We've also looked at Latin American countries like Mexico and Brazil. Now we're going to look at Iran for a little bit of a comparison between Iran and some of the Western countries. Iran, one of the things that makes its history so volatile is the fact that there's a split between the Sunnis and the Shiites. They're both considered Muslims. Although, by the way, Iranians are not Arabs. Iranians are Persians. They're Muslims for the most part, but they're not Arabs. They're Persians. And the two different types of Muslims that share Iran are the Shiites and the Sunnis. The Sunnis, who, by the way, control Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and many other Arab countries, and then there are Shiites who control other countries such as Iran, of course, and also have heavy presence in places like Iraq, Syria to a lesser extent, Turkey, etc. Okay, so Shiites, the difference is that Shiites believe that descendants of the Prophet, namely Muhammad, who's the patron saint, I guess, if you will, of Islam, is the only legitimate successors. In other words, only certain small group of successors are considered worthy successors to Muhammad, whereas the Sunnis, the other types of Muslims, have a little bit of a different view, namely that certain people, the caliphs, the people that took over after Muhammad, rightly took his place as the leaders of Islam. Basically, it's a distinction on who has the authority to rule Islam. It's not that much of a difference as far as we're concerned, but as far as they're concerned, it really is a very big difference. There is, in the old days, really before 1979 revolution, Iran was ruled by the Shah, which is like the emperor, the king, whatever it is. Now, the Shah was actually fairly friendly to the West, and even in those days, Iran, I wouldn't say they were friendly to Israel, but at least they weren't such bitter enemies of Israel. And there was the revolution, the Khomeini revolution, the Islamic revolution occurred in 1979 when the Shah was overthrown and exiled, and Khomeini, the Ayatollah, who was like the grand imam, the grand leader, the grand religious leader, took over, and based on that, Iran passed rules enforcing Islam on the people. Iran, in fact, is the world's only theocracy, which means that the government itself says that it's a religious government. That other countries are religious countries, perhaps, but Iran actually says that their rules, their secular rules, their general rules in the country are based on Islam, based on religious government. In the 1980s, really the whole decade, I remember when I was a kid, the entire decade, the Iran-Iraq war was going on. It was almost an article of a fact in the world that Iran and Iraq were fighting. They started fighting in 1980, and they didn't stop until probably 88 or 89. And during that time, the Islamists, namely the religious people who were in favor of the government being religious and enforcing religion, consolidated their power, and any rebellions, any secular people who wanted to get secular back into the government, were suppressed. From an economic perspective, Iran is what is called a rentier state. Rent in this case doesn't mean the same thing like you're renting a house. Rent means you make money based on your resources. Other people take out your resources or you give your resources to other people. Now, Iran is a rentier state because it makes most of its money, or it makes a lot of its national domestic product. It makes a lot of its product through oil. Iran is a major oil producer. And that really is what gives it whatever economic strength that it has. It doesn't produce a tremendous amount of other stuff. So it gets its national revenues from its massive oil resources. Because of the fact that the government has so much in terms of oil resources, the citizens would normally expect the government to create good welfare programs, alleviate the gap between the rich and the poor because it's really based on the oil, which is, it's publicly owned anyway, provide well-being for everybody. And that's what would normally be possible because of the wealth that comes from the Iranian government. But unfortunately, in Iranian government, there is a massive amount of corruption, which causes these benefits to maybe not reach the people that necessarily need it. In terms of the power in Iran, well, you have the leader. He is the highest authority in the Islamic Republic. This is a religious figure. This is an Ayatollah. I think now it's Khamenei. It used to be Khomeini, now it's Khamenei. Either way, he's the highest authority. And you also have the president, who's the head of the quote-unquote secular government. Although he is the leader of the government, he does not have as much power as the religious leader, since the religious leader is the head of the state. The state is considered a religious state, and therefore Khamenei, now the current Ayatollah, is the supreme leader of the state. They also have a parliament. Iran has a president and also a parliament who's elected. The president's elected, parliament's elected, and it's a unicameral parliament, which means there's only one house. It has 290 members. Most of them are Muslim, 285 of them. A couple of them are non-Muslims. But the parliament is called I don't even know how to pronounce that, so don't worry about it. And the thing about this is that all bills are subject to veto of the Council of Guardians, which is basically ruled by by Khamenei, ruled by the Ayatollah, and they're basically trying to make sure that none of the rules violate Islam, because that's why they would veto it, or if they just don't like it. There's the Council of Guardians, who gets to veto laws. There's the Expediency Council, which determines what is in the interest of the country. You can see, the president and the parliament only have limited authority. They only have limited power because whatever they can do can be overturned on religious grounds. The Constitution is not really democratic. It's more based on religion. They wouldn't look at being undemocratic as being a bad thing. They would say, hey, it's based on our religion and therefore it's good. Now you do have multiple centers of power. You have the parliament, you have the president, you have the council of guardians, you have the Ayatollah. Now, obviously, that prevents totalitarianism because you have this power divided up among so many people. But on the other hand, foreign policy negotiators often cannot deliver on their promises. If the president of Iran makes a treaty with the United States and then the Ayatollah abrogates it and says it's no good, then there's nothing really that can be done about it. So that's another problem with having the authority split in these different places. Now, Iran's not a totalitarian state, which means it's not ruled ironclad, by one individual, although the president does have a lot of power. I'm sorry, the supreme leader does have a lot of power, but it still is not considered totalitarian. It's not considered like a dictatorship, and the reason is, first of all, they do have competitive elections. Now, in 2009, there was a lot of controversy about whether the election was actually legitimate, but at least it was a competitive election. It's governed by religious principles, Islamic principles, and these oppose the idea of dictatorships, the idea of totalitarian governments. Also, traditional doctrine in Iran and in Islam itself allows private enterprise, private ownership, as opposed to communism. In other words, allows a little bit of the free market, maybe not to the same extent as Western countries, but certainly there is a free market. Whereas in a totalitarian state, the government would control everything, and that's not really what happens in Iran, even though there is a lot of power of the religious leaders to determine what happens in terms of the rules. Citizens in Iran are guaranteed freedom of speech, person, and association. However, the big caveat to that, the freedom in Iran, is that the activities must be within the criteria of Islam. If it's determined that somebody's doing something that would violate Islam, they do not necessarily have the right to do that. There is a reform movement in Iran to try to make Iran a little bit more democratic and to try to make it a little bit more free. And this was really started under Khatami, who was the former president of Iran before Ahmadinejad. Well, Ahmadinejad is out now anyway, but he was elected originally in 2005. But until 2005, for the last 8 years, President Khatami was a little bit more into modernizing Iran and making a little bit more freedom for the people in Iran. But that kind of stalled in 2004 when the Council of Guardians, on religious grounds, disallowed 2,000 reform candidates who were running for election throughout the country of different offices. He disallowed them on Islamic grounds, and of course what ended up happening was you had Ahmadinejad, who was elected, and he obviously is a very extremist and not really interested in freedom to any major extent. India is another one of those BRIC countries we discussed, the ones growing very fast from an economic perspective. I think we're actually covering all the BRIC countries: Brazil, Russia, India, and China. Yeah, we are covering all of those. India is actually the second largest country in the world from population. China is the largest. India has over 1 billion people and is not that far off. And the United States is third, which is way, 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 way down. So you can imagine how many people India has. India is only about 1/3 the size of the United States, and yet it has over 3 times as many people. India's political system, there's tremendous diversity in India. There's many religions, classes, languages, levels of regional development. India used to be part of the British Empire, so there are a lot of people that speak English there, but there are also many, many other ethnic groups that live there. In terms of religion, you have Hindus, you have Muslims, you have Buddhists, you have all sorts of different types of religions, you have different classes, different languages, etc. Having 1 billion people in such a diverse country obviously is something that may cause the country to split apart, but because of the fact that the government allows representation from all these different cultures in its government, that's one of the things that has kept India together. There's also a system of checks and balances, just like we have in the United States. Different branches of government and different elements of the government are able to look out for each other and look over each other's shoulders to make sure they're not violating people's rights. And that ensures that at least the rights of the minority are heard and respected. And just like the United States also, you have a federalist system, which means you have a central government that has power, but you also have various state governments that have power also. And you can imagine in a country as diverse as India, it's important to have the states retain some power because it's unlikely that one central national government will be able to represent the interests of all the people throughout the country. So it's important to have the individual states retain some level of sovereignty over themselves. People of a lot of different cultures have a lot of ability to govern themselves, which is very important. Their political culture, and again, we've seen a lot of these concepts over and over again, so you'll forgive me if it sounds a little bit repetitive. They have limited schooling. Schooling is not something that's run by the federal government. It's run by the individual states and the individual cities. Liberalization of the political culture, something more allowing more participation from various facets of the country, is something that's a trend. Penetration by electronic media. India has low literacy rates. Many people can't read, so electronic media, things that even people who can't read can see things, and then with computers and tablets and whatnot, are very important. Efficacy and legitimacy are very important in India's political culture. Efficacy, of course, means the effectiveness of the various policies and the ability of the people to think that what is happening is legitimate. As far as the elections go, elections are instruments of political socialization, which is a way that there are elections throughout the country, and that's a way that grassroots people can get involved in the government. Participation is stabilized at about 60% of the people who vote, about the same as the United States, I guess, and men, of course, turn out more than women. Women have historically been mistreated in India in a variety of different ways, and so although things are catching up a little bit, certainly women are still at a general disadvantage in Indian culture. India's foreign policy has generally been one of non-alignment. Since India was historically under the British Crown and just a British subject, when they gained their independence in, I guess, the 50s, they took on a policy of refusing to align with any particular alliance, refusing to go with the West against Russia or with Russia against the West, and they tried to use international cooperation rather than nonviolence to settle disputes. And that, of course, was taken from the example of Mahatma Gandhi, who was the first leader of India and the person who spearheaded the independence of India from British rule. And this has been India's traditional policy for a long time, basically since India started back about 50 years ago. Now there's a new international environment. Again, I'm not 100% sure why these things represent India's threats to India specifically, but these things certainly have happened. The end of apartheid, which means the end of the distinction between the class system of black and white in South Africa, but again, it doesn't have really anything to do with India, so I wouldn't worry too much about this. Okay. Popular authoritarianism, that's an interesting little phrase over here, which has an impact in India. That means authoritarianism means where people order other people around and tell them what to do, but popular means it's done with the people's consent. So in India, you have a situation where you have personalized authority. You have power of the government that's concentrated in the hands of a few people in the government, but generally speaking, that's not because they're totalitarian and force their will on the people, but because the people voluntarily give it up, and the people don't usually challenge authority to the same extent as you might see in other countries like, France, like we saw before. India has a parliament, just like a lot of India's rules and regulations and government structure was borrowed from the British, from whom they declared independence. You have two houses, again, just like in England and in Britain and the United States. You have the upper house, which is the Council of States, which is like the U.S. Senate. 250 members, some appointed. You have the lower house, which is the House of the People, again very similar to the Senate and the House of Representatives in the United States, or the House of Lords and the House of Commons in Great Britain. It's based on a simple majority system. If you win a district by one vote, you win the seat, and the votes of the Congress for laws is based on a simple majority system. There are some reserved seats for members of scheduled castes and tribals. Basically, in the old days, India used to go under a caste system. A caste, C-A-S-T-E, was a kind of a class, like a feudal class system, where people of higher castes looked down on people of lower castes, and people of lower castes would serve people of higher castes. And even though for the most part that's been abolished, you still have some reserved seats in the parliament for people of certain castes, maybe religious castes, whatever it is. They each serve a 5-year term. The legislative process follows the British practice in terms of what we discussed before. It goes to each house. The houses have to agree on it. Kind of similar to what we have in the U.S. and similar to what they have in Great Britain. And once both houses pass the bill, the president has to sign it in order for it to become law. An important terminology, an important word, I guess, an important idea in Indian culture is the word Swadeshi. That means self-sufficiency. The idea of only using homemade goods rather than importing. Now, obviously, you can't do that completely. You have to import some goods. You can't grow everything in the backyard that you're going to use. You probably can't grow your car in your backyard. But the idea of trying to be as self-sufficient as possible, growing food, manufacturing things, building things yourself rather than buying them, was an important component of Indian culture, and it's one of the reasons why they were able to remove the British. If they would have depended on British support for importing whatever goods they needed, it would have been much harder to throw out the British. But by not using British products, domestic products would be revived and the production would be done in India itself. And that's one of the, it still has, I guess, a place in Indian culture, this idea of trying to be as self-sufficient as possible. And finally, we have our very last group over here. We are our very last country, and that is the country of Nigeria. Nigeria is an African country, and we're kind of using that to represent many of the other African countries. Nigeria is a fairly representative country from Africa. The ethnic and religious groups are the biggest influence on the government, the biggest influence on the state. Certainly, there are many different religious groups and some diversity, but these are because of the fact that you have diversity and you have different ethnic groups and different religious groups, that's caused some strife in the government. It's had a fragmenting effect on the political culture because there are so many different ethnic identities and they each have their own beliefs. It makes them very difficult to work together. There are 3 major ethnic groups, and each group is found in a different part of the country. Many African countries have that issues. You have, in Rwanda, you had the tremendous violence in the 90s between the Tutsis and the Hutus, and in other countries, you've had also problems in Sudan. You've had other issues where different cultures, different groups, different tribes could not get along with each other, and you had tremendous violence that resulted from that. In political activity in Nigeria, in terms of running the government, you're talking about the people who are educated. Not everybody in Nigeria or Africa in general are educated. Many people are not. Also, people who are involved in traditional agriculture. The farmers have a strong influence, and the elites, the people who have become politically powerful, the successful businessmen, etc. Other people, the uneducated people and the poverty-stricken people, tend to be less active in politics, and unfortunately that also includes most of the country. One thing Nigeria has that most African countries don't, and most countries in the world don't, is that they have a very strong supply of petroleum, a very strong oil reserves. And because of that, they actually have a chance to be more economically stable and more economically viable than many other African countries. Benefits of petroleum, obviously it's a very strong natural resource and could bring the country a lot of wealth. They can sell their oil for a lot of money. The problems that have been caused in Nigeria because of oil, oil is a little bit of a double-edged sword. Number one, it can cause environmental problems when it's being mined, when the oil is being drilled and it isn't being done properly. Approximately 9 to 13 million barrels have been spilled since 1958. That's causes a lot of environmental damage. Also, only a few people control the oil. Everyone else has to live in poverty. The poor people become at the mercy of the rich. The people that control the oil drilling and the people that control the oil fields become very rich. Everybody else really becomes subjugated to them and doesn't really have any control. And also, because of the oil wealth, the government could become corrupt. The government, by controlling the oil reserves, really controls the entire national economy and really controls the country because of that. And it can be respected. Other countries, for example, if a government is very corrupt and very brutal, other countries might normally disavow it and not deal with it. But because Nigeria has oil and the other countries want the oil from Nigeria, they deal with the government even if the government is corrupt and brutal. That's some of the issues that Nigeria has faced. And that's pretty much all for the course. I hope this presentation has been useful for you, and thank you very much. Have a great day.